So my name is Fox Terrell. I'm Associate Professor of Digital Media at MIT in Comparative Media Studies and the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. And it's my absolute pleasure and thrill to introduce to you Dr. Ernest James Wilson III. So he is the Walter Annenberg Chair in Communication and Dean of the Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism at the University of Southern California. He's also the Professor of Political Science and Senior Fellow at the USC Center for Public Diplomacy. He received his BA right here at Harvard College, then moved on to University of California, Berkeley, where he earned his master's and doctorate degrees in political science. Now, some of the reasons I mentioned I was absolutely thrilled to give this introduction are because he addresses this issue of digital inequality, which is now so pervasive at all different levels of structure and infrastructure, ranging down from code all the way up through global policy. And so, for example, even the well-known and venerable notions such as double consciousness now play out in data structures and algorithms. So double consciousness can look like one representation you have of yourself on Facebook, another one that you have as your online account, another one you have for different social groups, and the different perceptions of each of those different groups. So the infrastructure itself now encodes the very notions that W.E.B. Du Bois argued and critiqued and presented for us. And what's even more insidious is just this idea that now these notions play out at a level where they become invisible and embedded. That is, that global policy that Dr. Wilson will talk about and even data structures and code are entirely interwoven. That is, redlining, for example, in the digital age requires that we understand the nature of digital technologies that are used to redline. So his academic interests then bring together all of these topics in communication, information technology, policy, public interest in a completely novel way. So the ensuing dynamics are addressed in innovative scholarly works such as Digital Media, Modern Democracy and Our Truncated National Debate, Digital Media, Democracy and Diversity and Imperfect Discourse, Negotiating the Net, the Politics of Internet Diffusion in Africa, the Information Revolution and Developing Countries, Diversity in US Foreign Policy, and many more. And Dr. Wilson points out, among other realities, that information is rooted in the politics and the social structure. He's co-editor-in-chief of MIT Press series Information Revolution and Global Politics, as well as co-editor of the Journal of Information Technologies and International Development. Beyond the walls of the academy, he's been an active proponent of inclusive digital media landscape. And again, this is important because our digital selves, our data bodies, are not just our real identities that we express with nuance and register and discourse and body language. Our data bodies are accounts and information on the data stream about us. So he looks at these media configurations across the board. So during his tenure as chairman of the board at Corporation for Public Broadcasting, for example, he set an agenda by founding its new Digital Media Committee and Public Awareness Initiative. Dr. Wilson translated his concerns about equal access within the US to globalization and foreign policy strategies as well. Now, according to him, the burgeoning electronic networks are limited by governance practices, among many other social political factors. Toward this end, he has served as committee director of international programs and resource on the White House National Security Council, and as consultant to both United Nations and World Bank. He's also adjunct fellow at the Pacific Council on International Policy. So most recently, he's been honored by being inducted into the Academy of Arts and Sciences last month. So please applaud for this. And this, of course, this was only one of the many honors that he's received lately and during the past 3 decades of his professional life, including a 25-year Achievement Award by the Public Policy and International Affairs Program in DC and numerous prestigious fellowships. So you can also find more information about this talk if you look on digitaldubois.net, as well as if you're a tweeter, then you can look at digital_do_boys, and you can find this being tweeted as well. So please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Ernest James Wilson III as he speaks on exclusion and inequality in digital societies, theory, evidence, and strategy.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. I do appreciate it. I could have sat there for another 45 minutes and, well, you know, would have enjoyed it too. But it really is a pleasure to be back at Harvard, and I'll explain the back at Harvard in a moment. Skip has sort of described a little bit of my misbehavior here. In fact, this is such a wonderful room. In fact, I think we talked about this at Mem Hall. The last time I was in Mem Hall before the installation event, the last time I was here, I think we were threatening to burn it down if they didn't do something. But fortunately didn't, because this is a really cool room. And so I'm delighted that we didn't take that step. But, yeah. But it really is a great honor to do this. And I know some of you have to dash in a moment. So I want to give you the punchline first, and then I sort of want to go back into let you know how I got to the punchline. The punchline came from me spending sort of months and months and months over the past year or so looking at data on various verticals, various media verticals that include television, radio, online, print, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as I looked at that, I said, well, this is interesting. There's a certain amount of lack of diversity in this particular vertical or another vertical. Then I discovered over time that in almost every one of the verticals, while media was becoming more and more central to the American political economy and the global political economy, the role of African Americans was shrinking in that vertical. So if you just visualize this for a moment, communication, information, media is coming to the center. Right? It's becoming more and more important at the macro level, at the meso level, and in our own lives. The average American, young American, spends 7 hours a day in some kind of mediated communication. So all that is happening, coming to the center. Meanwhile, people of color who are consuming that are becoming less visible in terms of ownership, in terms of content, and in terms of senior positions. Kind of centralization and marginalization going on at the same time. So over the next 2 or 3 days, what I'm going to do is to lay out that argument and what we can do about it analytically and theoretically, but also, as my generous introducer mentioned, what difference does it make in the real world? And what can scholars and practitioners do about that? So that's sort of in a nutshell where this lecture series will be going. Sort of conceptualization and theory today. I ask you to bear with me a little bit on that. And as has been done before, tell you a little bit about some of the personal motivations of how I got from this room when it looked a little different and was saying these other crazy things in the past to this room. And I think this is a story that all of us tell, because whatever the big categories, black, white, domestic, foreign, Jewish, Christian, Islam, we all have individual stories. And it's those individual stories, those individual narratives that are really interesting, that together make up the larger narrative. So I'll do the theory today. Tomorrow I will do case studies. If power is important, which I think it is, and that's sort of the major argument of this lecture series, how did it happen that African Americans and Hispanics and Asian Americans got marginalized? How did that happen? So I'll be looking at a series of cases. We'll look at the new Comcast, NBC, Universal deal. We will also look at 1996 legislation. And looking forward, we will also look at some of the online presence. For example, there's a publication called, is it The Root? I think it's The Root. And it's got competitors. It's got Griot. It's got Black Voices. So what are the implications for having large media now involved in the African-American discourse? So the third lecture will be, what are the implications of these changes, both for African-American political engagement, lobbying, et cetera, but also for intellectual engagement? Is there a black public sphere that still remains? And more broadly, is there an American public sphere, if the traditional avenues for talking about that, Daedalus or other publications, if they are being diminished and fragmented, and we don't go to the Black Scholar or Black World the way we do, we go online to maybe 10, 20 different sites. So do we have a public sphere? Or contrary, is this helping us? We have a larger public sphere as a consequence of this, these new additions. But again, so that's sort of been the bumper sticker version of that. But I wanted to put that forward and suggest that the focus on consumption and the digital divide being defined by access, that's the old digital divide. And Asian Americans, African Americans, Hispanics are basically catching up with white folks on that digital divide. That digital divide is not completely gone away in broadband, et cetera, but it's close. But there's a new digital divide. The new digital divide is ownership, control, and content. And it turns out those things are related. Ownership, control, and content. So that's sort of the punchline, in a sense, of this talk. But I really do have to say that I do want to thank Professor Gates for telling that terrible tale about discovering me. I looked up and I said, "Dr. Gates, I presume?" That's your response. But it's really wonderful to be here because Skip, in his person, represents a lot of what we will be talking about. And I do want this to be a dialogue, a two-way discussion. Because Skip was one of the first African-American intellectuals to go online with the Africana, with the encyclopedia, one of the very first to do it, not just to think about it and talk about it, but to actually do it. He is also one of the rare academics who has been engaged in what we call the legacy media, television, and breaking down barriers and crossing cultures in Africa, in the Caribbean, etc. So in each one of these platforms, the old media, and the new, Skip Gates has been there. So his presence here means a lot to me as a friend and also as a colleague. So I want to congratulate Skip on that path-breaking work in each of these areas. It's also wonderful, let me say, to be back at Harvard at this particular moment because 3 weeks ago we had an election. And the election was determined, I think, by the two issues that we're going to be talking about in this lecture series. Because in some ways the country was evenly divided, at least among white folks. 50-50, 49, nobody was quite sure. So what made the difference? What made the difference? The ground game, okay, and who was being brought to the polls as a result of that ground game? People of color. The brown people, the black people, the yellow people who voted in the high 70s and 80s for Barack Obama. So the two big issues of the coming century, I would suggest to you, were captured in what happened in the election. One, the white majority is becoming one of many minorities. It was the mobilization of African Americans and Hispanics, and to a lesser extent Asians, that allowed Barack Obama to win. Didn't have that vote, the guy wouldn't be president. But to get that vote, he had to use technology. He had to use technology. And they did they mobilized huge amounts of resources to do this for data mining, for identifying voters, for registering voters, for getting voters to the polls at the right time in the right place. And so we have then the co-joining of basically Barack Obama's victory. Technology on the one hand, mobilizing the ethnic vote on the other. Commentators from left and right, Democrats and Republicans, agree on this. This is not a partisan issue. The only thing that my friends in the Romney campaign, who I actually do have a few, said, we sure wish we'd figured out this technology thing before. We sure hope we'd figure, but they didn't. And I won't be partisan on that, but thank goodness they didn't. So that is pretty cool. So I think that in practical political terms, and this is where I'm going to go also with the talk, Barack Obama owes us. And by us, I mean, with all due respect, that weird collection of people who are both interested in media, communications, technology, etc., and diversity and race. Which I have to say, if you do a Venn diagram of that, it's not a lot of people. So God bless you for being in this room tonight, by the way. But Barack Obama owes you, because if you guys had not been working on these issues, he wouldn't be president. He'd probably have to come back to Harvard of all things and be a professor. So it's that coincidence that makes it especially delightful for me to be here on the professional side. Also, what could be cooler than giving the Du Bois lecture in this wonderful institution whose origins you described at a pretty good university? And so professionally, it's really been, it's wonderful to be here. But let me say something. I do also want to congratulate my very dear friend, Adelaide, who is, besides being a Washingtonian, we see each other every summer on the vineyard. We have a standing date. And she updates me on the 15 books that she's been reading, has news clippings of what I should read next, asks me what I have been writing, and say, hurry up and get it published. But she's been a very, very dear friend. I also want to thank others. My other mentor here is Willard Johnson, professor at MIT, who was also my mentor and teacher when I was doing African studies at Harvard. I would go all the way down to the other end of the avenue. But let me also say something about the personal collection. And here I will ask your indulgence. I promise you I will get back to the digital stuff. But in the spirit of the initial introduction, and in these hallowed halls, I do want to say that this is a particular personal pleasure. I had several unexpected and delightful aha moments of self-discovery in preparing for these lectures. As a child growing up in Washington, D.C., I knew that my maternal grandfather, T. Montgomery Gregory, had known Dr. Du Bois. Du Bois got his PhD in history in 1895, was it? 1895. So Du Bois got his PhD in history in 1895, and my mother's father graduated from Harvard in the storied class of 1910, which included T.S. Eliot, John Reed, Walter Lippmann, and people like that. So with Pop-Pop and two other ancestors who were Harvard grads, for a variety of reasons, I could have followed that in more depth, but again, for a variety of reasons, I didn't. Then when I was doing this research, I was delighted and surprised to find a picture. And it's very interesting. I was trying to go to the Moreland Spingarn collection in Washington to find it. Couldn't do that. At the last minute, I said, I know, I'll use the internet. Who knew? And sure enough, let's see, can I make this bigger? Okay, so I want to show you. This is the Armenia Conference. The Armenia Conference of 1916, which was hosted by W.E.B. Du Bois to come together to talk about issues not unlike the ones that we are talking about today and that we will continue to talk about. So this is W.E.B. Du Bois at the Spingarn Estate in upstate New York in 1916. Notice the tents in the background because they figure into part of the narrative I'm going to say. Okay, so Du Bois is, where's Du Bois? Let's see. He's in the back, and this is T. Montgomery Gregory. Can you see that? Can we blow this up? There we go. We lost a bit of it, though. So T. Montgomery Gregory is the gentleman lounging, I shouldn't say that, reclining in the front row with the mustache. So that's my grandfather, who it turns out was invited to the Armenia Conference, which I didn't realize until I was doing this research. only to discover that his brother-in-law, Mason Hawkins, who also got a degree from this university, was at that same conference. So it was a real pleasure to be able to make these. Turn off the projector, okay. I don't want to do that. Where's my, okay, I'll ask my guy to help out while I continue. So what is curious about this, the Armenia Conference, is how small the talented 10th was at that time. They all knew one another. And because of segregation, many of them went to the same undergraduate schools. And many of them also went to Harvard, Chicago, one or two other elite mainstream universities. So all of this got me thinking a little bit about the intersections of the personal and the professional, of politics and scholarship. And if there's any single truism in the field of communication where I now reside, it is that, thank you, it is that our narratives shape our understanding of who we are to ourselves and to others. This also raises a kind of grand Du Boisian question of agency and individual freedom on the one hand, and constraint and structure on the other. We are enabled by structures, we are discriminated against by structures, but we are also empowered by family, class, and race. So how do we become intellectuals and professors? Here in this room, for example, how in the world did we all find our way here on this rainy afternoon, each with our own particular yet intimate stories, and each with stories that we tell one another? So if you indulge me just a couple of more minutes, I want to talk a little bit more about autobiography. And I think WB, Dr. Du Bois, would approve, since he wrote 2.5 of them over the course of his life. I include Souls of Black Folks as kind of an autobiography. And then he wrote two others. So speaking of Du Bois and the Armenia Conference, let me tell you a little story that I think reveals something of the man himself, told to me by Sterling Brown. Some of you know Sterling. Sterling was a wonderful poet and a great and vivacious man who also grew up in Washington. His family and mine lived across from one another on the Howard University campus in the 19th and into the 20th century. He was also my grandfather's student and very dear friend. So when Francille, my wife, and I were living in Washington in the early 70s, Sterling invited us to one of the salons that he used to have in his very crowded study down in the basement. The salon mostly consisted of Sterling sitting around downstairs drinking bourbon and telling lies, but also telling these wonderful stories about this period of time. So one afternoon, he described his own experience at the 1960 Armenia Conference. The Young Turks, like Sterling, were put up in tents, as you saw in the picture, erected for the conference, while W. Du Bois was lodged in the main building. You see where this is going. Sterling slyly commented on their status. He went to the great man himself and said, "Dr. Du Bois, I see that the white folks have put you up in the big house." Dr. Du Bois, according to Sterling, looked at him and said very sternly, "Oh, Sterling, you will have your little jokes." I don't think that joke was funny enough for Dr. Du Bois to leave the big house, but I think it does capture something of the formality of the man. He was very active, he was very engaged, but as Anthony Appiah has described it in some of his work, he really was a man of the 19th century in many ways. He was a man of the 19th century, even though he died in 1963. There are other personal connections. I could go on and on. I had the good fortune to meet Dr. Shirley Graham Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois' wife, at the first annual W.E.B. Du Bois Essay Award given by the Black Scholar magazine. I'm not sure there was ever a second annual W.E.B. Du Bois Award, but I got the first one. And so Dr. Du Bois and David, her son, came to that ceremony. And she paid me what at the time I thought was a great compliment. She looked at me and she said, "My goodness, you look like Dr. Du Bois." So I was initially flattered, and I realized that, well, maybe she means when Dr. Du Bois was 90. So I was maybe a little bit less flattered at that thought. And then there are other connections, family connections going forward and going back that bring in the Washingtons and Frederick Douglass and all. It's a very interesting story. Some other time I will talk about that. But the point I want to make is that these are stories, I think, of relatively successful academic achievement. And I'm not sure these are stories that we tell a lot, either in digital form or in traditional platforms. And I still feel, to be quite honest, in saying to this audience, that talking about these relationships feels a little weird. My elders thought it was quite bad form to talk about one's family. This was not particularly done. Second, I came of age during a moment when African Americans were searching desperately for authenticity, for blackness, and our roots in the deep African past. It was politically incorrect to being bourgeois, or bougie as it was called at the time, and that was an insult to be called. I wish Martin Kilson were here, because this is a riff that he and I played for 4 years and since. So it almost seemed to be politically incorrect to be well educated. That is, some of these cultural pathologies still exist in our community and must be weeded out as we head into a knowledge society. We have to cherish these stories like the ones that you heard from about Adelaide, and stories I think that Dr. Du Bois would approve of. We hope that our children will be able to talk about their erudition and their social networks as we head into the kind of society that privileges knowledge. And these are values I think that W.B. Du Bois he certainly valued, and I think that we have to follow him and begin to cherish knowledge in ways that perhaps we have not up to this point. Du Bois himself personified the ability to cross these borders from New England to Ghana to the UK to Africa to China, where he met Mao Zedong. There are wonderful photographs of Dr. Du Bois and Mao Zedong, laughing with one another. So here was a guy who could do it all, and I think that ability to cross borders, that ability to write and think across multiple platforms. He did novels, he did poetry. We would call that multimedia today. We would call that multimedia. He founded the Crisis magazine and 2 others. So that he provides us, I think, a reminder that we need to step back from all of the daily clatter and Twitter with which it's very easy to be enamored. And we need to think deeply, think about the structural issues that lie behind all of this technology, the class relationships, the status relationships, and not simply the latest gadgets, because the latest gadgets are really appealing. In fact, physicians have demonstrated that kind of feedback that you get from these little gadgets does infect sort of the endomorphs and other chemicals in your body. And it's much more interesting to do. You get much more immediate feedback than writing a damn speech. And I think all of us have had that. I'll just do a little bit of catching up on the internet. Well, that may distract us from the larger questions, and that's something that I think we do want to think about. So my purpose in the lectures is to offer a framework to help us understand how, in the transition from an industrial to a post-industrial society, the structural position, the behaviors, and ultimately the interests of those on the bottom of the social pyramid and outside the boundaries of privilege are being transformed. And also to report on how some of those on the bottom and on the outside, especially African Americans, are designing and pursuing strategies of resistance, strategies of engagement, and strategies of innovation. But alas, as we will see, too often to mixed results. Put differently, what has been the experience of African Americans in trying to negotiate their positions here in the opening stages of the transition to a post-industrial society. A post-industrial society that is built not around brawn, but built around brains. Not built around just vertical hierarchies, but also built around networks. And more concretely, who is doing the negotiating for African Americans and other people of color and others who are excluded? And how do they articulate those interests? Is it the NAACP? Is it the National Urban League? Is it the Congressional Black Caucus? Is it Common Cause? Is it Eric Schmidt? Is it Barack Obama's Federal Communications Commission? So who's doing the negotiations to try to bring the people in the bottom of the society and the outside of the society more to the front? And what I'm going to do is suggest a way of thinking about that. But let me just also rattle off why we should pay attention to this. Last time I gave a version of this talk, Randy Kennedy, who I think maybe just hopped off to get his kids, said, "Why should I be interested in this?" And I said, "Randy, damn good question." So let me suggest why we should all be interested in these issues of the transition from an industrial to a post-industrial society. Why should we care about the media? Why should we care about communication so much? Number one, as scholars, these are really interesting questions. Independent variables and intervening variables and dependent variables, whatever else you're interested in, these are theoretically and conceptually important questions which are being inadequately addressed in communication studies, in sociology, and I would also venture to say in African American studies. All of us are guilty in this. And one of the themes that I will come back to again and again and again is African American studies has got to do a better job of studying this stuff. It's imperative. It's like not studying industrialization when W.E.B. Du Bois was doing his work. Secondly, we should care about this because we are citizens, because it is truly the case that these are matters of the life and death of democracy. Full stop. There is no democracy or freedom without a free press, in whatever form that press may take. The free flow of information is essential to our democracy, and with the demise of so many publications in the press, it is not clear that we have a healthy system for the provision of information in the public interest. We should also care about this if we want jobs, or if we want our children to have jobs, or our students to have jobs. I think there's some students in the room. If you want to have a job, you need to figure this stuff out, because it is moving to the center of employment, of investment, of innovation, and all of these things are critical for us. And I think as an ethical people, we should be concerned about the least among us, to understand the new dynamics of exclusion as well as inclusion, especially in a lecture named in honor of W.E.B. Du Bois. And if you're interested in African Americans in particular and people of color in general, then you should pay close attention to these issues. African American status in a knowledge society may not be a happy picture in the future. And we in this room need to do something about preventing a dystopian future and try to guide more toward a utopian future. Indeed, at the end of this lecture, as I mentioned, I will make some very specific and concrete recommendations about what could be done on the scholarly side, but also on the more activist side. Very quickly, I want to ask you to do two things. This is a thought experiment. There's a vast community of intellectuals who believe that these new technologies are transformative. They are absolutely transformative. My friend Nicholas Negroponte was one of the first to talk about this, and he genuinely believes, I think believed and still does, if you take one of these or a laptop and you put it in a village, what will happen? It will transform the village. The villagers will become more knowledgeable. They will know the price of fish in this market town versus that market town. They will know, be able to access education on this device. All of which may be true. But that's an interesting starting point, because the jump between the micro level use of a tool which is what this is. And social transformation is an ambiguous relationship in that model. We go from here to modern society. How does that happen? Let me suggest, and so therefore, what is the future for people of color or people who are disadvantaged in that kind of world? It suggests get one of these and welcome to the knowledge society. Now I'm being a little bit provocative. It's not quite that bold, but it is largely at the core that kind of argument. Now there's another argument that says, well, let's start off with social structure. Let's start off with class structure. Let's start off with the differences among communities in wealth, for example, that the median household net worth for whites in 2010 was $110,000. $110,000 median income for whites. For blacks, for black households, it was $5,000. White African Americans are more than twice as likely to be unemployed as whites. 16% of black males over 25 years old have graduated from a four-year institution. 33% of white males have graduated. A tiny percentage of African Americans, 4%, have met all the standards to be fully qualified to pursue a STEM-related job: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 1 in 3 of black males has been somehow involved in the criminal justice system. A majority of African Americans in Chicago don't finish high school. Now, that's a different starting point. It's no less true than the other starting point. But what I want to suggest to you is that to say that all we need is one of these, and it will resolve the social tensions and contradictions and difficulties that are faced by those who are at the bottom of society and who are excluded from the benefits of society, is naive. And so therefore the question becomes, how do we figure out how to tell both of those stories at the same time? Because they are both true. But we're not 100% sure about the way in which they interact at this point. So what would Du Bois have said? That was a question, in fact, that is up here, text responses. I sent that question out to a number of people, including Ben Jealous of the NAACP, Michael Copps, who was at the Federal Communications Commission, a guy named Manuel Castells, my colleague at USC, who's probably the most widely cited person in communication. They all gave very interesting answers. I urge you to go to the site and take a look at it. But I think this is what Du Bois would say. He would say 5 things. Number 1, whatever the answer to the question is, it has to be based on sound empirical evidence. This may seem obvious, but it's the starting point. You think back on his Philadelphia Negro, that study that he did, and many, many others, empirically based. He didn't make it up. Secondly, it would require rethinking and perhaps rewriting conceived conceptual and theoretical frameworks, as he did, for example, about the role of blacks in the Civil War, and through his reframing of race in a global context. So we need to reframe, get the data, but reframe it theoretically. Thirdly, matters of exclusion, oppression, and discrimination, especially by race, must be front and center. It is personally shocking to me to read some of the leading texts in the field of communication, transition to a knowledge society. You run through the index, and guess what you don't find in the index? Y'all. You do not find race. You barely find class. You don't find discrimination in some of the texts of the leading intellectuals in the field of communication and media and the transition to a digital society. Fourthly, all of this, I think, Dr. Du Bois would say, must lead to purposeful and progressive action. It's good to write studies, and some of this, as one of my colleagues said, which Du Bois are you talking about? And he said, well, what would Du Bois say? Well, Du Bois lived to be 93? So are we talking about the young Du Bois, the old Du Bois? At one point in time, Du Bois said knowledge and information will make us free. At another point in time, and the talented tenth, by the way, was the carrier of that. You should read a speech he gave in the 30s to the graduates of Howard University about his thinking of the talented tenth at a certain moment in time. A lot of chastisement. So it's not enough just to do the research, although I love to do research. I think it's important. I think Du Bois did. But that should lead to some kind of action. And then finally, we should be aware at all times that we are operating in a global environment. Now, I apologize in advance for not talking about that aspect of Du Bois's work, or but that would not have, I suspect, it would be 9 lectures if I had tried to do that. But that's an important starting point. Now, let me just lay out very quickly, and I'm going to bring it toward an end. One way that I would suggest that we think about all of these issues. Okay? There are a bunch of different models, very different kinds of theories, concepts, and they all have their strengths and weaknesses. I'm going to suggest, and by the way, I used to do PowerPoint, but then I read that old maxim that said power corrupts, and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So I've gone back to what I hope is appropriate technology. And I want to make a couple of quick points in how we should think about this and how I will frame the subsequent conversations. C at C. C at C stands for communication at the center. Communication at the center. And arguably what this means is that in a global context and in all other contexts, media, communication, etc., was sort of important, but it wasn't as central as it has become. And that is true, communication coming toward the center, in a number of different dimensions. At the macro level, at the meso level, and at the micro level. And if we want to understand and keep a track both of how society is changing, but also the role of discrimination and exclusion in those changes, it's not enough just to look at the macro level. I looked at some figures of African American labor participation. Look pretty good. About 10%, 11% of the workforce in those industries is African American. And we're about 12, 13% of the population, so that's not too far off. In some it was a little bit more, the regulated industries like public utilities. In software it was much less. But the point I want to make is that these changes are so enormous and so far-reaching. They are equivalent to the change from industrial society, or rather from agricultural society to industrial society. We're doing the same thing. Du Bois lived during a period of the transition from agriculture to industry. That's what he wrote about. We need to be writing about the transition from industry to a post-industrial world where knowledge is at the core. So this is a way to think about that. So communication is moving from a peripheral position into a central position, not in geographic terms, but in terms of its importance. And I want to suggest to you that there are 3 ways to think about it further. In the old days, this was, for the sake of argument, and this is completely heuristic, that's the share, the percentage of communication, media, and entertainment in the old days, let's say 1900. In terms of GDP, in terms of exports, media, communication, et cetera, is becoming much more important. Okay? That's just the first point I want to make. But we can't stop our analysis there. It's kind of boring. Well, economists do that, but they're kind of boring too. So that's one level. That's at the very macro level of society. What about the meso level? What's happening inside of organizations? More and more of the content of what is produced in the United States is not steel. If you look at a car, the value of computers and digital equipment inside the car is more valuable than steel or aluminum. If you look at organizations like Harvard, maybe not Harvard, but most organizations, they are becoming less hierarchical. They're becoming flatter. Because all those middle-level people who used to do the communication between top and bottom or internal and external are being fired, or they're being restructured, I guess is the polite way to say it. But again, the second point I want to make is that structure is important, but so are institutions and organizations. And if we really want to understand how we're becoming a communication society and what's happening to African Americans, we need to look here. We need to look here. And then number 3, of course, let's see if I can write this, the Chinese symbol for person. How's that for showing off? Like, unless somebody actually knows how to write this, in which case it'll be embarrassing. But at the micro level, what's happening? What's happening to American citizens? And within that, what's happening to African Americans? You've probably seen an analysis that African Americans and Hispanics are overrepresented in terms of Twitter. Very interesting. Also in terms of other kinds of mobile platforms. They have developed a set of skills, attitude, knowledge, and experience, competencies, if you will, that are appropriate for these kind of organizations in this kind of structure. And these things eventually will align with one another. The problem with some of that data is that there's a way to analyze the individual level behavior to try to figure out if that is an investment in social and personal capital or whether it's a waste of time. So just because you see big percentages of African Americans and others tweeting, there are a bunch of arguments there. One, if you look at the content of what they're tweeting, it's entertainment and sports, and then sports and entertainment. They're not reading the New York Times. I mean, most kids aren't reading the New York Times, let's be real. But the point I want to make is that there is a method, there is a whole school of sociologists and psychologists who are working on the differential impact of SES, of social and economic status, and its impact on the way that people use these new technologies. We don't all start off jumping from our mother's womb and picking up a cell phone. You've got to be trained. You have to know how to do search. You have to know which search engines will reveal what are their strengths and weaknesses. So my point, ladies and gentlemen, is that if we're going to understand the transition from an industrial to a post-industrial society, we need to do it seriously, and we have to do it at 3 different levels of abstraction: macro level, meso level, and micro level. And what I want to suggest to you today, and I will say more about in the next lectures, here, here, and here, people of color ain't doing so good. People of color ain't doing so good. Again, as I said, if you look at the verticals of radio, TV, movies, press, I don't have time to go through all the statistics. The numbers show that African American participation is at best stagnant or declining in terms of ownership, senior management, and content. Now, this is a tremendous shock. It was a shock to me.
Could you say that again?
Yes, because in some ways, this is the headline for this talk. And it was a big surprise that if we disaggregate what we mean by communications, media, and entertainment, if we disaggregate that into a series of verticals, separate industries. So we have radio. We have television. Is that better? Yeah, okay. That's better, okay. Radio, television, movies, newspapers. In the gross aggregate, it looks roughly okay, but if you look at senior management, and if you look at ownership, it ain't so good. Here's a figure. In 2009, African Americans owned 1% of broadcast assets. 1%. Now, 2 or 3 years later, guess what that figure is now? 0.7%. That's the other part of this, which is that there's a scissors effect. At the same time that we're seeing this in terms of consumption, we are seeing this in terms of ownership and management. And the thing that is especially shocking to me, because as Skip knows, I now live out in La La Land. So it turns out, I didn't know how this happened, but I'm actually the dean of a school that does this stuff. So I guess I had to learn something about it. So I tried, and it was puzzling, because I've worked on the oil industry, I've worked on privatization, I've worked on a bunch. This is the weirdest damn industry. Turns out that the content produced for television and movies and increasingly any mobile platform, it's not an industry. It's a guild. It is a guild. So if you look at the numbers, for example, 1,300 episodes of primetime television. How many women producers or directors? Maybe 2. If you look at hit motion pictures and you look for stars in front of the camera, or even writers, for God's sake, in the writer's room, the numbers are either, and this is the industry's number, it's either stagnant or declining. Put another way, the core of the modern American political economy is what? It's getting whiter and maler in many respects. Now, there are some categories where that's not the case. I don't want to make this a black or white picture. It's not that dichotomous. But relative to the consumption and use that we see, especially among African American youth, relative to ownership in those industries, it is a shocking picture. It's probably the single most amazing thing that I found in doing this research. Now, why is that the case? Well, we'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow when I go into specifics, but it has to do with access to capital. It has to do with advertising, not wanting to advertise on African American or other channels. It probably has something to do with culture, and a culture of entrepreneurialism or lack of same in these various industries. And then there's one that I think is a useful way that I find to think about this, bring it to an end. Is this a problem of a pipeline? There are not enough people in the pipeline. Could be. Is this a problem of a glass ceiling? Is this a problem of a club? Or is it a problem as you think about a career and mentoring and advice being given at the front end of a career? Does that happen to the same extent for African Americans and women as it does for white males? So there are these various options: pipeline, glass ceiling, club, and mentoring, which is not quite the same thing as pipeline. So again, I'm going to address these in some of the other lectures, but it is a very thorny issue, I can guarantee you. We have a mutual friend who's a big producer in Hollywood, he didn't talk about it this way. He told narratives which I then abstract to this picture. So you start off as a horn player, and someone says, you play a really good horn. Why don't you think about being an orchestra director? I don't know how to be an orchestra. I'll teach you, don't worry. Okay, so somebody helps out this individual, and he goes up in status and in terms of skill. He's a very good orchestra leader. I said, you could do a great job in movies. I said, I could. I don't know how to do movies. I'll teach you. He does movies. You'd be a great investor. Me, invest? I'll teach you. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think if you add up the pipeline issue, the glass ceiling issue, the club issue, a lot of it gets condensed and focused, if you will, on this process, which I know now takes place in Hollywood. I suspect it may also happen a little bit in Silicon Valley, where some of these issues are the same. So in conclusion, the point I want to make is that we're in a tough place. People of color moving into the post-industrial society are in a tough place. And we're in a tougher place than I thought we were before I started doing this research. Now, having said that, let me end on a faux note of enthusiasm and forward-looking, is that there are these weird moments in time. And I know there are a couple of you in the room who have worked on policy issues. I've done that most of my life, as was said in the introduction, back and forth, amphibious. Most of us who are scholars who think that policy is cool and want to have some impact work on one issue for a long time, and then we go to Capitol Hill or the regulatory agencies or the private sector and say, look at this brilliant work I'm doing, and nobody's interested. Sometimes what happens, the regulatory people come to the scholars and say, we need a study tomorrow looking at we need an alternative to neoclassical economics, which will look at an ecosystem of media and diversity. Can you give us one of those? And we say, absolutely. That'll be 4 years and $500,000. Doesn't work. Every once in a while, there is a coincidence of a bunch of scholars who've been working on an issue and a federal or state or private actor who wants that information in their own self. It has nothing to do with your entire scholarship. It has to do with what they need at a particular moment in time. And in turn, there is a political world and a set of political actors who, in fact, need that information and are pressing. Guess what? We just happen to be in one of those moments right now in terms of federal policy toward all of these issues. And I wouldn't have said this a week ago. On Thursday of last week, I got a copy of a letter that had been sent to the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, Julius Janikowski, a gentleman that I worked on in the transition and on the previous campaign, who was chairman of the FCC, good buddy of the president's. And this letter was sent by the NAACP, the Urban League, I think La Raza, Congressional Black Caucus, Common Cause, ACLU, and what did they say? The letter said, Dear Chairman and 4 other commissioners, y'all are really messing up because the Third Circuit Court of Appeals told you that you're not doing a very good job in analyzing the relationship between concentrated ownership and diversity. This was under Chairman Powell some years ago, who tried to redo it so that newspapers and TV could own each other. Some of it got through, but the Third Circuit Court of Appeal said, we're going to stop it. So last week, the FCC produced this report that I described earlier about 1% to 0.7% in ownership, similar in other industries. At the same time, he said, but maybe we're going to relax the concentration, the prohibition against more market concentration even further. So if you do that, what is likely to happen? The numbers, if the market gets more concentrated, and Time Warner, and the New York Times Company, and Malone, and others can buy up more property, the way that Clear Channel did in radio, what do you think that's going to do for people of color or women who don't have the same capital base? So what they're saying is, Mr. Chairman, don't take any radical steps until you, drum roll, drum roll, drum roll, get some additional analysis and data. Now, just for the luck of the draw and a couple of other reasons, we at the Annenberg School for Communication has been hosting a national coalition of scholars and activists putting together data and arguments in favor of a new way of thinking about the public interest as far as market concentration and diversity is concerned. So we just happen to have a set of scholars The FCC is getting beat up, thank goodness, by these organizations. The Third Circuit Court of Appeal is saying, okay, we've been asking you for 3 years, where's the study? Where's the data that will allow you to justify increased concentration, because the impact on minority voices may be negative. And by minority voices, it's not just color, it's women, it's also a political perspective. And, one hopes, the newly reelected president of the United States might, in his second term, might become interested in these issues. He has, operating out of the White House, he has a K through 12 STEM initiative, science, technology, engineering, and math. There's some other hints that President Obama might be interested in the stuff that we're talking about here, but we don't know for sure. All we know is we have the data and the methods. The court told the FCC they got to get their act together. The NAACP and the Urban League is beating up on the FCC to do something. And if we don't get this right, we're in trouble. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story that I want to tell. That we are moving from a situation where communication and media has always been sort of important. Now it is central. And it's affecting the structure of society, every institution, and all individuals. Going from this thing to this thing, the question becomes, are people of color going to be here and central? I mean, I haven't talked about music. Look at, I mean, African American music has transformed the culture of a generation or two or three. Hip hop. The civil rights movement in the 60s transformed the women's movement. Well, what's going to happen with the communications revolution? Are people of color, Hispanics, African Americans, Asian Americans, going to be central, or are we going to be peripheral? And it is, as they say, when academics want to duck something, it is an empirical question. But I will hazard a guess that if those of us in this room and colleagues at these various institutions, including at the Bob Iger at Disney, who you would think would have an interest in getting better content. Well, where do you get better, more diverse content? Well, you might try Asian American, Hispanic, and African American writers. So we're sort of at a tipping point where this trend could go in a dystopian direction or a more positive direction. And so I hope that you will keep with me in this conversation, both over the next couple of days. And don't forget www.digitaldubois.net, where we will continue the conversation. And now, again, I apologize for communicating much too much this afternoon, but I would welcome any comments that you might have. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
Ernie, we do some...
oh, sorry.
Thank you very much. You could be second. How do you explain... I mean, I was thinking about, us calling each other bougie, and how that was the worst thing that you could be. So we were in denial about our own class status,
right,
and all that it meant to come to Harvard and Yale and all these other, Smith and all these other schools. Because, Kingman Brewster, the president of Yale, when he addressed us, he said, you were one of the 1,000 male leaders chosen. They did not play around. You are going to be in the elite. This admission has changed your life. You're going to be rich and famous, but not famous, rich and powerful,
right,
or powerful. And
they never said, "Or you get your money back."
No, they didn't.
Oh, they kept that endowment.
But they weren't embarrassed about it at the top. But we were embarrassed about our class status, and even we had a uniform, which is blue jeans, and it was vulgar to talk about, whatever. But we are very entrepreneurial people. I mean, look at the inner city. Some of the poorest people are the most entrepreneurial. Unfortunately, end up in jail but they found an entrepreneurial route through drugs, and we've always had an entrepreneurial impulse. So there are these two contradictory things. You have the elite embarrassed about its status and looking upon entrepreneurship as vulgar, underclass embracing entrepreneurship but not having perhaps the most positive outlets for their entrepreneurial impulse. We had the black church, was very entrepreneurial. Black preachers, right? They self-sustaining, self-contained black institutions going back to Richard Allen. And they're still, the Bethel's still there, et cetera, et cetera. How do you explain, I mean, it's one way you're going to go is like, okay, white men are still writing things, the system is still racist, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So, and that's true.
We know that.
But what about the black side? What part falls onto us? For example, you said, thank you very much, but you said that with Anthony and I started Africana.com, it was unprecedented.
Right.
The only reason we did it, the truth is, we didn't do it to make history. We did it because we had such a terrible, we did Encarta Africana, as most of you know, and we had such a bad, Microsoft gave us $1 million, and a guy named Frank Pearl gave us $1 million. So we needed $2 million to edit this thing. The deal we had with Microsoft was so bad, we got like 0.1, to produce a CD-ROM that you buy probably cost a nickel, and they would sell for $50. So we got a tiny percent of the net.
Right.
It would have taken 1 billion years to pay off that $1 million advance. It was in the form of advance. So a friend of mine who had graduated from Harvard Business School said, you should look into being able to sell it. Because if you go to the Harvard bookstore and you buy a $10 book, Harvard bookstore gets $4, right? Or $6, it depends. They get the bookstore. Not the author, not the publisher, but the bookstore. So become the bookstore. And I go, oh, wow, how do we do that? He said, well, you should start something called a .com. I go, what's that? Remember, this is 1999.
Right.
And I talked to Microsoft. They said, okay, if you could do it in 30 days, we'll let you do it, right? So we went to Israel. And we got guys who did the military, ex-military Secret Service spy stuff for Israel. They had set up a pioneering internet company, and they designed Africana.com in 30 days. We bent the Microsoft deadline. Then I went to the same guy who had the idea and got $500,000. He was the angel. And we did the whole thing with $500,000, and we sold it in a year late for many millions of dollars. Right. And, and it came from white people is what I'm saying.
Right.
If I had gone to Bob Johnson, which I did.
A number of us have been down that route.
You know what? I used the conversation with Bob Johnson to get Time Warner to buy that company. And he never had intended to buy that. He said he would think about it, right?
But see, this is where the duality of agency and structure comes to the fore. And just idiosyncratic stuff. I mean, and I had an interesting I had asked the same question of a CEO of a company in Hollywood who works for one of the most successful African-American entrepreneurs out there in business. And he said, it's interesting. And he said, I've never been personally discriminated against, but I just look at what happens in my industry. And it's terrible, he says. People don't get promoted. I mean, the extent of continuing clubbiness in that industry is still shocking. I mean, I'm from Washington, D.C., and for any of you who know that town, I mean, it doesn't get any more, incestuous and blah, blah, blah as Washington, except for Hollywood, which is Washington on steroids. Because you figure there are like 100 million people who all want to get one gig as a third assistant director. They're all qualified, they all have degrees.
Or a producer,
or a producer.
Where the money is.
So I think that what we still see is a lot of structural impediments, and that's access to capital. The point that you made. I mean, you and I probably couldn't go to our uncles, or our neighbors, which is where, or our overseas cousins, ethnic cousins. Most of the investment in China came from where? Overseas Chinese. What launched the Chinese economic revolution was people on the mainland calling in those social network relationships in Hong Kong, in Thailand, in Taiwan, et cetera. We don't have those structural network ties. Now, this
Except through Harvard or Yale or that kind of school.
yeah, and if you look at, in fact, I'll talk tomorrow about Black Planet and Net Noir. You know, the guy who founded Net Noir was probably overeducated.
David Ellington.
David Ellington has got like he's got a BA, he's got a law degree, he's worked on Capitol Hill. That is not the traditional picture of people who are entrepreneurial. So I think that our class, if you will, still disproportionate. This is kind of the reverse of the, all right, we're overeducated. But I am also told by a black woman in Hollywood, she said, I have a BA from Columbia and an MBA from Harvard, and the two white guys I work for have no college degree.
But a lot of people in Hollywood have BAs in English from Harvard or Yale or Princeton.
Yeah, so I think part of what I'm going to propose to you, and I think I saw Professor Higginbottom here also. Okay, hey, Emma, is that if we take this seriously, what are we going to do about it? And I think what we have to do about it is rethink what we're teaching, rethink how we are teaching. For the last 18 months, I've been going around talking to CEOs of media, communication, and entertainment companies and saying, when you hire people, what are you looking for? And when you promote people, what do you promote them on? And they rattled off A, B, C, D, and E. So if you want me to hire your students, they got to have that.
Yeah, but Ernie, there's one more thing, and then we open it up.
Yeah. But just to make one,
okay.
we have to teach this.
Yeah, but the
In our-
risk. But to be an entrepreneur, you have
Yeah.
to risk, and we are risk averse. So that if you look at the list of the richest white people, the richest people in America, most of them are white, and the richest black people, it's a big difference. The white people's list is full of entrepreneurs.
Correct.
The black people list isn't. It's full of people who work for corporation like Ken Chenault, worth $125 million according to Fortune, works for Amex, right? There's no risk. I mean, he could. Amex has its own money. You look at the billionaires, a lot of guys who just rolled the dice, went out there, and they went for the gold, went for all or nothing, and they got all.
But see, we've set up, it doesn't sound like a commercial, but we've set up something called the Annenberg Innovation Laboratory, the AIL. We partner with Verizon, IBM, Warner Brothers, France Telecom, Petrobras, Microsoft, and a bunch of these other companies. It is an incubator to figure out how to become an entrepreneur. We teach people, we literally put them in an elevator. It's only like a 3-story building. We put them in an elevator and say, okay, let's hear your elevator pitch. And so, all I can say is, I know what I can have access and control over. I'm a professor and a dean. I can teach stuff, and I can find talent and train that talent and incentivize that talent, not to just go work for IBM, but to invent the next thing that will replace IBM, which is what's happening. So I think that what we have to do is not just be as the, you know this expression, we don't want to be the sage on the stage, we want to be the guide on the side. It's awful, I know, but that's true. And that's what MIT and Harvard and Stanford are doing. It ain't clear that Tougaloo, Howard, or others are doing that.
Even the black kids graduating from these type of schools are still risk averse and not
Yeah.
becoming entrepreneurs.
Well,
like their white
yeah, but that's one of these structural things. That's like saying, okay, well, I can eventually get through this wall, but it'll take me a little while. And so I think what we need to think about are what are those things which are action accessible in the short to medium term. And I think what's action accessible to me is I can teach my students this stuff and then put them in an environment where, we're starting an experimental college. Not 4 credits, not 3 credits, maybe no credits, 1 credit. It's all about entrepreneurialism. It's all about experimentation. And I think those of us who are at these institutions need to do that, because when I go look at these labs, I haven't been up to Stanford yet, but the last time I was at the media lab at MIT, I didn't see a lot of folks of color. Well, I did. Actually, they were from China and India, but not African American. And so therefore, that old term, if you'll pardon the expression, affirmative action, we need to act the same thing that people did with us. Said, young man, you come with me. I don't want to go. I said, you come with me, said Willard Johnson. Said, you are going to learn how to write a refereed article. And what we need to do is bring entrepreneurs, black, white, other, anybody, to teach an African American studies program, to teach in communications program, to teach this stuff. And that begins to chip away at the next generation and the next generations to get at that issue.
I cut you off, and then William Joyce Wilson.
I've worked in higher education in Newark, New Jersey for more than 30 years. And one of the missions of higher education in Newark, New Jersey is to attract underrepresented groups to STEM and healthcare professions. We have very active programs. We focus on Newark, which is primarily African American.
Right.
Try as we might, despite the fact that the kids are very technology savvy and have all the ability in the world, they do not choose STEM. What's your take on why that is?
What do they choose instead?
What do they choose instead? They often go into like political science, they'll go into business, but we can't. Now, there's a general problem attracting kids to STEM, but it's been particularly stubborn with African Americans. And I got to tell you, in Newark, we have run every program in the world. And, it's like, should we just quit trying?
Yeah, I know. Do you have a response to this? Okay, and then to Professor Wilson. Do you have a partial answer to help all of us understand what's happening there?
I'm sitting here and I'm having a bifurcated experience with what you're talking about.
It's the dual consciousness
Yes.
veil thing. Don't worry. Yeah.
I happen to be an African American woman, obviously. I'm an MIT alum. I'm a Harvard alum. I've been self-employed for over 20 years because I found a way to circumvent the gatekeepers and the dream killers who told me what I could and could not do. Wait, let me just... No, but what I'm saying is I'm also decided to do, as opposed to doing other things, I just devoted my spare time as a STEM education advocate in the area. I was just at the Friday after Thanksgiving Rube Goldberg chain reaction as part of MIT K-12 STEM. I talk at Microsoft where they have the Digigirls. I talk at Google because I want the girls to see that I don't look like Gates and I don't look like Zuckerberg, but I do what they do. Oh, God, no. But the point I'm trying to say is the young ladies I meet, some boys too, but usually the young ladies I meet around here, they're not from Kentucky, they're not from Ohio, they're not from the bayous of Louisiana. I'm talking about this incredibly rich environment in Massachusetts. These kids are starving for guidance. I incorporate the entrepreneurial. I tell them that the barrier to entry with open source software, with open source hardware, it's so much less. The risk is so much less than it has been in the past. And the kids are very, very receptive. But they are also aware of the problems that they may have if they go into a field and go for a PhD. So I try to tell them to go around people who don't want the best for them.
Let's
This is not a conversation between you. Attorney Wilson respond.
yeah.
Put your comments in the form, ma'am. Put your comments in the form of question.
Well, let me answer it this way. Let me answer it this way. We're all in the same boat. This is all about experiments. And by definition, with any luck at all, half of them will fail. This is what we have to teach, that taking a risk means failure's okay. If you look at the serial entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, and if you look at the venture capitalists who fund them, you know what venture capitalists, I'll put my $3 million in a startup, but I got to find somebody who's failed. I got to find a young woman and a young man who has failed, because that's about risk, and how do you handle that failure? And all I can say as an educator, as a dean, advisor, is we just do what we can do. We try it, it doesn't work. Maybe, with all due respect, maybe there's something wrong with your program. Maybe if you talk to this sister back here, don't be defensive, don't be defensive. Don't be defensive. All I'm saying is, this world is a world of experimentation. And those who will succeed are willing to try and fail and try, etc. So I just want to say hello to this brother here. I haven't seen him in a while. Good to see you, sir.
I think the first time we met was in 1979 when there was this conference on
That's
the
right.
declining significance of race. And you were one of my supporters, not about the declining significance of race, but you came to my defense for people who were misinterpreting what I was trying to say.
There was another conversation, early conversation, around industrial policy
Right,
that the Joint Center had put on.
precisely, right. So you whetted my appetite, Ernie, and I'd just like to pursue several things. Maybe you'll be talking about these issues later. But I was surprised to hear you say that you were shocked by some of the figures that you uncovered when you looked at the issue of inequality in digital societies more closely. And, you know, this suggests that there are gaps in our empirical knowledge. And I wondered if you would sort of talk about some of these gaps, maybe give some direction for further research. You also mentioned that our theoretical frameworks should be rewritten, and I wonder if you had some examples of some theoretical frameworks that we need to revise. And then the third point, maybe you're going to get into this in more detail in tomorrow's talk because it's on social policy. But this is a huge problem we're talking about here. And you said that, you know, W. Du Bois, one of the things that he would suggest would be purposeful and progressive action. And that's a lot. You know, what kind of purposeful and progressive action would Du Bois have in mind, and maybe you have some examples.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate it. Right. We've had wonderful discussions over the years. And there was a moment in time when the issue of industrial policy, what was the government going to do to intervene? That has since become a dirty word, industrial policy, although we pursue it, although we just do it badly. So in some ways, these are the same kinds. What's the role of the state in intervening in markets? On the practical one, I can answer that very easily. We have a 135-page review of the literature, which is an annotated critical bibliography of 400 entries that look at the relationship between diversity, the local needs of communities, and what we're calling the ecology, the media ecology. That's been put together by this CPRN, the Communication Policy Research Network. So I would love to invite people to participate in that network, especially since last Thursday, these organizations have said we need more research. So I think that kind of work, which is both empirical, but it is also emotional and conceptual, in the sense that most of the people who do these kinds of studies in Washington were trained at my other institution across campus, the Kennedy School of Government, or their counterparts. And as many of you know, schools of government and policy rely, not exclusively, but largely on neoclassical economic thinking, which is focused on individuals, not communities, which looks at material benefits, not other kinds of social benefits, and which may problematically translate from a straight market economy into a more networked kind of economy. So someone said, reason doth not remove what reason hath not provided. So I think that 80% of this is coming up with alternative framings, ecology models rather than narrow market models is one, collective action models, not just individual models, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of leeway there to do really interesting theoretical work. Tomorrow I'll talk about my own approach, which I call strategic restructuring, which is similar to the structuration argument. Empirical research, here's one that I think that is really necessary. Does it make a difference? Does ownership still count? Because traditionally, the policy world said that the production of content is a triangle, okay? If the base is content, one side is ownership, and the other side is management or leadership. Owners, just hire managers. The managers decide which markets they're going to appeal to, and they produce content. Well, we know that is true, or at least there are studies that demonstrate that to be true under certain circumstances in the legacy media. Is that still true in online? Let me give you a close example. There was Net Noir, which was founded by an African-American entrepreneur I'll talk about tomorrow. Omar Wasow founded Black Planet. They each have been sold to either Huffington Post, Washington Post, or NBC. Traditional assumptions and theories would suggest that in any kind of circumstances, that triangle continues. Ownership, most importantly, then management, then content. A couple of questions. Has that been true on black-owned sites where we see a certain kind of content? Is that true for The Root, which is owned by the Washington Post, but managed by African Americans, as I understand it? Founded by African Americans, a nice distinction. But does it make a difference? That is ultimately an empirical question. It's absolutely an empirical question of the kind of research, interdisciplinary research, that I think we could benefit from. So I mean, that's both a theoretical as well as an empirical.
Right, so I wanted to ask just about the relationship between the engineering level and the three levels that you have here, because you mentioned at the beginning, you take the device and present it, and you criticize the technological determinist argument that just the device alone will have some transformative effect. But of course, the device also can have values built into it. And so what I want to ask about is the relationship between, and also to propose, say, this fourth data level and the way that those values can affect these other levels. And just to give a couple of examples of what I mean, so even at the micro individual level, we have these kind of cases, anecdotal cases, just say in virtual worlds where the traditional model for skin, for characters, actually the light reflectance model isn't optimized for darker skin, so you can't have a kind of luminous self-presentation, or the HP camera that doesn't have that actually can't see people with darker skin tones, right? Right. So you have these kind of cases that's built into the engineering level, and to give something that's not anecdotal, recommender systems, for example. So this is referring to your scissor model for consumption. Recommender systems, right, where you have systems, basically a kind of a matrix of users and a matrix of products on Amazon, and then you find clusters.
Or recommenders for individual competencies of other individuals.
Right.
Which is starting to expand.
Right, but just another good example, but just this idea that in some sense consumption and consensus is manufactured algorithmically, right? These systems suggest purchases by people who are like you in the same neighborhood. So in some sense, you just begin to reify social preferences and patterns of consumption. And so those are just a couple of examples, but it's this idea that these values are built in at the technical infrastructural level and the data structural level. And so how does policy then begin to intersect with, because also these are rule systems that are built in, these systems outlast their creators that just build in kind of hegemonic values. And so how do you reconcile your, the three-part distinction here with the way that values are built into data? How does data and engineering intersect with policy?
Right. And this is an honorable tradition of inquiry. I mean, people like Larry Lessig and others have sort of said, how do social values get incorporated and embedded in the software that we use on our computers. And there are enough examples of that to suggest that it is an issue. The example that I love is Second Life. I don't know if any of you have done the virtual reality. It's pretty cool. You go in and well, I mean, I liked it at first, but it's like really capitalist. It is a marketing tool. For those of you who don't know, you log onto a computer, you go to a site, and there is a world there that's been constructed, houses and buildings and automobiles, and you get to be a person. So you choose your avatar. It turns out you get sort of a bland avatar, I mean, sort of like, standard model issue for an avatar. But you can jazz it up. You can buy your skin, you can buy your face, you can buy your butt, you can have wings, you can have 2 heads, you can live in a castle. But to get this stuff, you have to pay for it. You have to get Linden dollars. How do you get Linden dollars? You send this company real money, a check. They cash that check, and you don't have it anymore. But what you do have is a new butt and wings. And there are some days when I said, maybe if I got some hair, or I could, something. But I think this is the most glaring example of the relationship between conceptions of power and beauty and agency. I know, but this is virtual rather than virtuous. But I will have to say, with all respect, that given the threat of being here or being here, because of the power relationships that exist within society, I am much less worried about code writing biases than I am about the failure of more people, including the alleged talented 10th, which is probably the talented 1th in some way. But I want our students to know this first, then I'll get them to the code piece. But it does come, I mean, as a metaphor, and this is something Larry Lessig writes about all the time. In fact, let me close with this, because you're the perfect person to represent this. We talk about ownership, content, employment. What we never talk about, is the tape running?
Yeah, that's all.
Oh, well, let me be over here then. What we don't talk about is the experience of many people in this room who go to Aspen, who go to Davos, who go to professional associations, and the topic is the future of the world. There is an Aspen group meeting that brings in European government and private sector people to talk about the rules of the game over intellectual property rights, access, etc. I don't know, I know I'm not unique in this. Almost every one of these things that I go to, I'm the only African American in the room, but more importantly, these kinds of issues are not being discussed. Now, sometimes at Common Cause, Institute for Progressive Economics, maybe they're talked about there. But this, what do we call it? The invisible level, the level of guiders and steerers and designers. It is called power. But it's a level of power that we don't even talk about. I mean, this is the end of the conversation for today. And what I am concerned about is that I want to equip the next generation of young people to understand all of this stuff. So they will be invited into the rooms at Harvard and Yale and Stanford and so forth when decisions are being made about the architecture for hardware, for new modes of biotechnology that will impact whether people of color are more central or whether they are thrown on the technological, ash heap of history. How's that for an optimistic note?
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank very much.
Thank you, good sir.